So a little bit about the Vico Office architecture. As you can see, I have in the bottom of the screen a generic process to indicate where we are in the typical workflow. Typical workflow starts with publishing models, activation of the models, and analyzing constructability to make sure that you're using correct quantities for your quantity takeoff and cost planning. Then doing the actual takeoff, planning the cost, and then the last box is managing data, which includes compare and update, import Excel. I also want to include the reporting stuff in there. But first, the Vico Office architecture. When you start Vico Office, you start the Vico Office Client. And the Vico Office Client has all kinds of functionality included in it, which is delivered through modules. The Vico Office Client contains all those modules, but the modules are activated or deactivated based on the presence of a license. So the Vico Office Client is what you see here. Now there is a whole separate piece of Vico Office, which is the Versant databases. That's a separate layer. And in order for Vico Office to present the data that is saved in the databases, so your project data, all the shared information, it needs to communicate through a TCP IP protocol. That's the red line. And that red line sometimes turns out to be critical because it is inbound traffic using the Internet protocol, TCP IP, which is sometimes classified by an antivirus software as problematic and therefore blocked. If it is blocked, you will see Vico Office Client start up, but it says I cannot read anything from the database. That can be solved by disabling the antivirus, or even completely uninstalling may be required. To work around that, we have now three options during the installation process. That is the client with the database server, which is the way that we have installed Vico Office so far. So both the Versant databases and the Vico Office Client are running on your local computer. Then the second option, which is new, is only database server. So if you want to connect with your computer to another computer in the network which contains the databases, that is now possible because you only have to install the client and only install the database on the other computer, which is the third option. If you receive the information from another computer, you connect to the other computer just like you would using the Internet, because it connects to an IP address that is different from your own. So in that case, you don't have the blocked traffic problem. That's a little bit about that and explaining why sometimes the antivirus software is causing problems. Then the Versant databases, in the estimator situation, we had always two database files, and that was the PRJ, or project database file, and STD, or standard database file, and that was it. All the projects, regardless of how many projects you had, 1, 5, 20, or 100, were saved in that single project database. Now, if you use that project database for a long time, the size of the database explodes. So not a feasible solution, not really scalable. So that has been changed for Vico Office in that every project has its own database. So what the Vico Office Client connects to is really a collection of databases. It is a collection of project databases that you've created by adding a new project in the Vico Office Client. Every time you start a Vico Office Client, it will load the information of those projects that you created. So the more projects you have, the more information needs to be retrieved from those individual files, which explains why sometimes it takes a little bit longer to present the dashboard, because each individual project database has to be opened, and it needs to read when the database file was last edited, because that's something you want to know. In addition, or besides the project databases, we also have a shared database, and the shared database contains all the user settings. So those do not contain any project data. it is things like column widths, size of your workflow panel, visibility of your workflow panel. All those kind of things that are user-specific are saved in the shared database, and there's only one of those. What's also included in the shared database is the report templates. The report templates can be saved as a template file. We'll talk about that during one of the latest sessions. But if you create a project and you want to send the report that you created for that project as well, you need to make sure to include in your mail the report template file, because it is saved in the shared database, therefore not included in the project database. When you want to include the report that you created for a project, it does not suffice to pack the project and send it off. You need to include the report template as well as a separate file. Speaking of packing, what happens when you pack a project is that the database service for that project is stopped temporarily. So you create a frozen status of that project, and after that, that status is zipped. So the .vico file that you create when you pack a project is really a zip file that contains the current status of the project. Last thing that I wanted to point out is the use of references. I mentioned earlier that in Estimator we have the concept of a standard database, a standard library that you could use to copy information from. Contains the knowledge database, or the knowledge for cost planning in the company. That has changed as well in that we made it much more flexible. You can use any project as a reference. You can still decide to make one project in your collection of projects in the Vico Office environment your standard. So you can say I have a standard hospital project from which I pull my standard cost planning information every time I start a new one. But it mainly means that if I have 5 hospital projects that I've completed in the past, I can open every single one of them and cherry pick what information from those projects I want to use in the new one. When you copy information from a reference, you can do that in several ways with copy modes. We'll talk about that in the planned cost session. But during a copy operation, the unique ID of the entity that you copy is maintained, as well as the unique ID of the project that you copy from. Each project, so each database, has a unique identifier, which is not visible to the user, and cannot be changed. And that is to support that mechanism. You want to know from which project you obtained certain information, so when you want to update it later, you can do that. That, however, does result in a limitation that we have to deal with today, and that is when you pack a project, unpack it on your computer, and rename it, you cannot save as. So in say, a Word document, you can save under a different name and you create a copy. You cannot do that today with your projects in Vico Office. There is no save as command, because you cannot change the unique identifier of a project. Compare and update helps to work around that. You can copy the content of a project to another project, and by doing that, create a full copy of a project. And how that works, we'll look at that during the import and manage data session.